Good morning, or good whatever time it is wherever you are. Here now, it is Thursday morning at 8:30. And today we're going to talk about China. So I'm going to go ahead and fix my links. So because Twitter doesn't give me the links properly, doesn't auto-populate the links properly. So I'm going to go do that real quick. I'll put this on the screen so you can see what's going on. I hope you're having a pretty good day. And I think it's going to get a little bit better. I'm going to explain some things and it's going to make you go, what? Huh, weird. Wow, neat. And then you'll understand where we're at. China's economic growth over the last 50 years has been miraculous, but they are not the first to do it. I explain how they did it, why it traps them now, and why Trump brought all the CEOs to Beijing this week. Da-da-da-da. And then my other links here. All right. All right, so let me explain why all this matters. Good to have you with me today. We're gonna talk about this, and it's gonna be kind of interesting because I have to start it at a little bit of the beginning, so I'm going to go pretty fast here. All right, so feel free to ask questions if something doesn't make sense. So China's gone from dirt poor in the 60s to reasonably wealthy by international standards. They would be called a middle income country because I mean there's so many Chinese, they're not that wealthy overall. But how did they do it? How did they do it? Well, they did the same playbook that other countries in the past have done. And what they do is the government says, okay, we have this much money. And they're going to say, we're going to spend this much money on what? On building things because they had no infrastructure. They didn't have buildings, they didn't have roads or airports or anything like that because they were a dirt poor country in the 60s because they had this communist revolution and all this other stuff happened. And I'm not going to get into that. But so they're like, okay, the government says, okay, we want to grow at 8%. So they take a certain amount of money and they give it to all these governors and they say, you got to spend this much money on projects. And they do, and they spend that much money and they build stuff. And it counts as GDP, gross domestic product, which is basically how much productivity an economy creates. If the GDP grows at 5%, that means the amount they produced increased by 5%. And it's generally a sign of how wealthy a country or society is. So they do that and they build roads and it's great. And then the next year the government says, okay, now you're going to spend this much money, which is more money than last year because the economy grew, and you're going to build more stuff. And they build more stuff and it works and it's great. It's like, okay. And it works for a while. It works for a while. It works for decades. But then something happens. All the stuff that needs to be built gets built. Right. So they don't need any more airports. They don't need any more bridges. They don't need any more trains. But the government says, nope, we got to grow more. So here's the money, build more stuff. And so they go, okay, well, what can we build? And so then they build a big train station and a train line that goes nowhere and doesn't serve very many people. Or they build a bridge. I saw this lake, and there was like a road that went around the lake, and they built this giant bridge, like a mile and a half long, over the lake. And all you had to do was just take the road around it. There was no purpose for it, but it cost them like several $billions to build it, and that counts as GDP. That counts as economic growth. Now, this is the government mandating this. This isn't somebody with money or capital going, hey, we need this. I'm going to build it so it's going to be profitable. No, this is the government saying, you're going to build this. Build it. This is why you have all those empty cities, right? There's all these cities. They built entire cities in China that can host 1 million people, and they're empty. They're called ghost cities. So they built all this stuff not because of demand, but because they wanted to force the supply. What happens when all the projects that have been useful, that would be useful, have already been built? Well, then at that point, there's no profitable way for the government to build things. And so every dollar or yuan or whatever it is over there that the government spends loses money. It loses money. It's like the government just says, okay, build this train station that goes out to rural Mongolia, and it's a $20 billion train station and a train line and everything, and there's like, maybe 1,000 people that use it. In order to be profitable, it would need to serve like 10 or 20,000 people a day. So they start losing money. Well, what does that matter? Well, because in order to finance these things, the government doesn't just give them a big stack of money. They do these financing structures where they say, okay, you do this, you sell some of your land on a lease, you take that money, and then you build things. Okay, a lot of it is sourced from the local level. So these governments, local, are in enormous debt. But they can't pay the debt back because the things that they're building now are losing money. So what do? Now, the government can't just say, in China, they can't just say, well, we built everything that needs to be built, so we're just not going to do that anymore. They can't do that because for 40 years, the entire system over there has been built, structured, and organized around government money. They only do what the government tells them to do. The businesses and the government are so intertwined that it's hard to tell them apart. So they can't just go like, oh, we're going to stop, because they would have mass unemployment and quality of life and incomes would plummet. And so they can't do that. They can't just cut it off like that. So the thing is, China is not the first country to do this. Right? That's the interesting thing. Some of you are old enough to remember the 1980s when Japan was just killing it, and they were going to overtake the US. They're going to overtake the US as the world's #1 economy. Now, Japan did the exact same thing. They had government-funded investment, and they invested in all these things in technology and factories and all this stuff, and they did great. Who else did this? The Soviet Union, the USSR in the 60s did this. And there was this giant fight in the 50s and 60s between the USSR and the US, the communist versus the capitalist system. And they did the same thing. The government forced investment. The government says, you will do this, you will build that, instead of people trying to do things that are profitable and productive. Germany did this in the 1930s. After World War I, their economy was absolutely obliterated. Their entire country was destroyed. They had no infrastructure. And so they started doing forced government investment to rebuild things that needed to be rebuilt. So all this has happened many times before. Apparently, the United States did it sometime in the 1800s, but I couldn't really get much good information on that. The point is, this has happened before. The government investment is a known strategy. Okay, but this causes problems, like I said. Now let's examine what happens. See, when you have government investment that gets forced, right, because of how you define GDP, Okay. Once that becomes negative, once the productivity of government investment becomes negative, you're stuck. You have to unwind that you have to unwind that debt. The bad debt has to get written off. The bad debt has to be eaten. It can't be on the books anymore. It can't be like, oh yeah, well, this local government province owes, $500 billion, but it's okay because they just pay a certain amount per month or year, and they're just going to just hold that debt forever. Eventually, they run out of money to pay the debt back. They can't even, it's not even paying off the debt. It's they can't even make the monthly payments anymore. That's when the debt crisis happens. So let's see what happens. In the 80s, well, let's start with the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union in the 60s, when they ran out of productive projects, the Soviet Union collapsed. The countries broke up, the Union collapsed and broke up into a bunch of different countries. Started, kaboom. Nobody invaded them, nobody took over. It was just this big collapse, and they had to rebuild from scratch again. That's one way out of it. That's one way out, is collapse. Japan did probably the smartest way to handle it. Okay, there was so much fake GDP growth, because remember, when the government spends the money, it counts as GDP. It counts as GDP growth, even if it's unproductive. And so that loss of money over the years of that unproductive project, that has to be unwound. And by unwound, I mean it has to be paid off and the debt written off somehow. Somebody has to eat the debt. And that takes a long time. So Japan did this thing where in the 80s, everybody thought they were going to take over the world and be the number one economy in the world. No. What happened since about 1991? Zero growth in Japan for about 40 years. Zero GDP growth. Why? Because that's how long it took. Any growth that they had was applied against the debt problem that they had, right? The productivity debt that they had. And it took 40 years to even that out. Just in like 2022 or 2023, they started growing again. Their economy started growing again. It took 40 years. These are called lost decades. And Japan took 40 years to do that. They finally got rid of all of it. And now their growth is no longer applied against future unproductive, past unproductive stuff, but it applies to real future productivity. So that's number two, right? Number one is collapse. Number two is multiple decades of lost growth. And China's done this bigger than Japan. So China's lost decades will probably be 50, 60 years. What did Germany do? Well, in 1930s Germany, they got to a point where they were going to have a debt collapse, and they started a war. And in fact, there's some evidence that they started it earlier than they wanted to, because they just couldn't wait any longer because the debt was about to collapse everything. So they started a war. Okay. So those are your three big choices in these situations: collapse, multiple lost decades, start a war. There is a fourth option here. And I'll get into that, why Trump brought all the CEOs over to Beijing this week. The fourth option is to take money away from the government and give it to the households. Okay, currently consumption as a share of GDP in the United States is around like 65 to 70%. In Europe, it's like 60%. In China, it's like 40% or 45%. It's super, super low. And the way you can fix that is by, instead of having your GDP built off of investment, you have it built off of consumption as well as investment. That means transferring an absolutely enormous amount of money from the government and the government-owned businesses to the households in China. Now, they could do this by basically like giving every Chinese person the equivalent of, I don't know, 3 years of wages, just a giant transfer that way. They could probably do it with like universal health care, like some sort of social security or pension system. But that's not going to be enough. They have to flat out give the Chinese individuals huge amounts of money to balance this out. then those Chinese people will start buying stuff. And that every time they buy something, it's somebody else's income. Okay. And that shift from government to households will eventually pull things out. Right. So that's your fourth option. Now, do you think China's going to allow itself to collapse? No, they'll do anything other than that. That's not on the list. What happens if China tries to do lost decades? Well, China's too old. Their birth rate has been so low for so long, they can't really get out of it. If they went to another 50 years of lost decades, they would have no kids. Their population would just crater. They can't do that either. So they want to start a war, which is what Taiwan is about. Well, it's one of the things Taiwan is about. They want to start a war. Why? Because in a war, all your factories and manufacturing get built. War is incredibly expensive. You pay for all these things, and all this stuff gets destroyed. Right? You use up your ammo, you use up your missiles, all that stuff. Stuff gets shot down and blown up and sank, and all this stuff. And so that money gets spent, but then the thing gets destroyed, so you have to build something else. Okay, so that helps bring the economy up. And that's where they knew that this is where China was going. They knew that's where China was going. And you've heard a lot of people talk about, oh, they're going to invade Taiwan at some point pretty soon. We don't know exactly when, but they're going to do it. So that's where China's in. They have those three options. Now Trump is doing this. Oh, they can't do option 4, which is give money to the people, because that would basically turn them from communist to capitalist. That would change them from communist to capitalist. And the communists are just not going to give up their control over the money flows. They're not going to do that. So here comes Trump, and he's like, okay, well, I'm going to Beijing to talk with Xi. And you know what, this time I'm going to bring all these CEOs of all these multi-billion, trillion-dollar companies with me. Now, what I think he's doing here is he wants to make it so that option 4, changing from government investment-led economy, manufacturing economy, to household consumption economy, Trump wants to make that viable. Because if China opens up and stops being so communist and starts being more capitalist, just about everybody wins. The households get richer because now they can make money, they can buy things, their standard of living increases. The United States gets richer because now we have 500 more million people to sell stuff to. Okay. That also changes the dynamic of the international geopolitics, because why do we need to compete with these people that we're just trading with naturally? We have the same basic capitalist system. We're all making money. Hooray! Everybody wins, right? Why would we want to go to war with another capitalist country? Right? So that reduces the threat of war. And so I think that's part of what Trump is doing with this visit. I think he wants to make option 4 a viable option, because none of the other ones are good. Collapse will destroy China. 50 years of lost decades will destroy China. They'll just be too old and small after that to really do a whole lot. War will be disastrous for a lot of people, but it's one of the only ways China has out. But opening up and becoming more capitalist and switching the GDP from government investment, to household consumption, that's a big win for a lot of people. A lot of people. And so that's what I think he's doing. I think there's other things going on too. He probably wants to show, look, we have all these great companies, and we're ahead of you guys, and so you better do this if you want to catch up. Otherwise, we're going to keep you stuck forever. I mean, there's multiple levels of that trip. I'm not going to pretend to understand all the nuances there, but I do think that's at least part of it. It's like, hey man, we could do all of this together, and look what world we could create together. This would be pretty awesome, wouldn't it? And it gets you out of your debt trap, and it makes us rich, and then you guys don't have to collapse or start a war. And hey, if you do this, maybe we'll even share some AI chips with you, which they've been withholding, and you can give us rare earths, and everybody wins, and all this geopolitical tension ratchets down, and so much good happens. Now, I think that's really gonna happen? No, China's been going on the same trajectory for the last 50, 60 years. All the people in charge have lived with that their entire lives. They have no concept of any other system. Plus, they've been propagandized their entire lives to think that capitalism is necessarily going to fail and ends up with degenerate, weak, and greedy people. And some of those criticisms there's some validity to those criticisms, but I don't think they're going to change. I do think that might be enough to get China to pressure Iran to make a deal, because China also needs Iran's oil. So that's where China is at right now, and there's more to it than that. It's a very high level overview, but I've been studying this. I've been following this for about a decade now, maybe more than that, and it's just fascinating how this is playing out. It can't end any other way. The way uh, the government investment happens. We've seen it happen before in all these other countries, and those are the only ways out. So we'll see what happens. But I do think that China is in a little bit of a stuck place, and it's not a great situation for them. So we'll see what happens. So thank you for being here with me today. If you enjoyed this or found this interesting, feel free to share it. If you like and subscribe, it spreads my reach through the algorithm, which is pretty great. And yeah, feel free to check out the links in the description. Oh yeah, so Chad says it's amazing how many people believe Trump is just a buffoon and has no idea what he's doing. Yeah, this is very clever, and personally, I think this is Scott Bessent. If you don't know who Scott Bessent is, he was an international trader that went up against governments several times over the last 40 years and won. Dude is an absolute killer. I'm pretty sure he's orchestrating some of this international economic incentivizing of things. I think he understands how that stuff works, and I think he's probably the big driver of this one. But Trump was smart enough to go with it too. So yeah, have a great rest of your day. And tomorrow is Feel Good Fridays at 8:30. So if you want to start your day tomorrow feeling good and making decisions from that position of feeling already good, join me at 8:30 tomorrow, and I will talk to you then.